thank you all for joining us. There's just 2 days left. This is our penultimate day of Real Abilities, and this is your chance to catch up on all the films and join us for a whirlwind of conversations. Just to tell you what's coming up a little bit, we have today, right now, you're here for the conversation, the Q&A for Augmented, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Then we have at 3 p.m. Our Lights, Camera, Access workshops with Dolby and Blackmagic. 5 p.m. The World is Bright Q&A presented by DCTV. And 7 p.m. tonight in a different key Q&A presented by Lincoln Center for Performing Arts. And tomorrow is closing night. We're going to have at 5 p.m. the pilot reading of Disgraced and the closing night film Not Going Quietly with a special guest, Temple Grandin, as well. Please join us for all of these and more and help spread the word. Tell your friends. There's only really less than 48 hours to see all these amazing films and to access this program. Now to Augmented. We're really excited about this conversation. I personally am a huge fan of this film and have a great lineup. I want to give a big thanks to all of our partners who make this festival possible and who are doing the work on the ground on a day-to-day basis. Adaptive Climbing Group, who you'll hear more about in a moment. NYC Kids Project, and Penta Prosthetics. And I know Penta Prosthetics is a new partner with us, and they actually send used prosthetics to countries where there is no access to prosthetics. So check them out at their website. I'm very excited to introduce first I'll start with the moderator for this conversation. She's the founder of Adaptive Climbing Group, Karima Betts. Karima, thank you so much for being here.
I'm really excited about this conversation.
Good. Folks, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll be happy to bring you online to ask them live, or just raise your hand virtually or in person to get our attention to bring you online to ask questions, or note in the chat if you can't ask it live, we're happy to read it out for you. So hopefully that covers the way for everyone to be able to be a part of this conversation. Our speakers for today, we're honored to have the subject of the film, Hugh Herr, here. Hugh, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
And then we have the producer of the film, Gideon Gill. Gideon, thank you so much.
Oh, well, pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for including our film in your festival.
It's an honor. And the director of the film, Matthew Orr.
Hello, Isaac. Thank you. And as Gideon says, thanks so much for selecting the film. We're thrilled to be part of the program.
Thank you. Karima, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Isaac, and thank you, Real Abilities. It is a pleasure and an honor to not only be a fan of this film festival, but take an active part in introducing these amazing gentlemen straight out of Boston. Us East Coasters are going to have a great conversation about this film, about being an amputee, about working in engineering. Get ready. So just some basic questions for you gentlemen. First of all, Matthew Orr, I am a fan of you as a person who's had a New York Times membership my entire life. I love your work. Stat, Gideon Gill, you're amazing. Obviously, how else would we get our information in a fun layman's way? And then of course, Hugh Herr, pioneering climber, pioneering amputee. Couldn't say anything more. We do have some general usual questions that I'm sure you've already answered because you've been doing the rounds with this film for a little bit. So my big question is to all three of you, because you guys entered into this project on different roles. Gideon as a producer, Hugh Herr as of the subject and the guide through the story, and Matthew Orr as the narrator and the filmmaker, creating that visual and editing that aspect of creating that story. What did you hope would be the impact of a film like this? Because this is not just a documentary, there's a life story in this, there's a timeline, which is very different, I think, from some of the other films that are also in this film festival so far. Can I start with you, Gideon?
Sure, yeah. So initially we started out with the idea of telling a more modest story, and actually telling the story of Jim Ewing, who is the who is the amputee, who is the first patient in the clinical trial with this new approach to amputation and connecting it with the prosthetics. And we then realized that there was a much bigger story here. It was a much fuller story to tell. And I think our hope in telling this story was to really bring to a wide audience some of the really important issues that Hugh has raised in his work about, the efforts to really, Hugh talks in the film about wanting to eliminate disability. The whole, it doesn't like even using that word. But I think we wanted to bring to the forefront some questions also about what does the future look like when people can augment themselves, and their broad issues of access and equity in getting the ability to use this technology.
Matthew, or as a storyteller, a longtime storyteller yourself, what drew you wanting to create this visual and sound aspect of the story?
Yeah, I would just add to what Gideon said. I mean, we initially set out to, with Hugh's permission and access to the lab at MIT, tell the story of Jim Ewing being the first person to undergo this novel new approach to amputation, and what that would look like in the lab as they tried to figure out how to get the technology of the mechatronic limb to, for him to be able to function with that. It quickly revealed itself to me and to Gideon that we had a pretty big and important story here, that this new surgery, which it was unclear how effective it was going to be, it was rapidly showing itself to be very effective, at least in what we were seeing as we were filming in the lab and interviewing with Dr. Carty and interviewing with Hugh and others. Hugh, I kept, popping in, and I was always around and filming, and he was like, "Oh, you're here again." But we decided we wanted to invest the time and effort to try to accurately tell this story. An important one. I think the surgery, this new novel approach to amputation is big and could potentially be the standard of care in the future. And we wanted to be there on the ground to see that science unfold.
I agree. And as someone who personally knows Jim Ewing, and we're both involved with Sterling Rope, I agree. Seems like a happy-go-lucky guy. He's very serious, but so is Hugh, but you get the idea. Happy, expressive as they get. And for you, Hugh, you're all about the work, right? You're a very technical individual. These are creatives right here, and they're invading your personal space. I mean, like you said, he kept bugging you. So how now that the film's over, now that you see the impact of the invasion of your work, how do you feel about it?
I feel really privileged and honored, and I'd like to thank Gideon and Matt for involving me in their storytelling adventure. To me, the film, what's so important to me about the film is really underscoring this idea that we can use technology and innovation and creativity to rethink what was human limitation. So too often today, human conditions result in a limitation because of poor and often non-existent technology. And this is really a story of how we can do bionic body reconstruction and really jump over that chasm of human limitation and provide people abilities that they so seek and desire.
It's a wonderful, thank you. Matt, being that his process also takes a long time, and the stages of where you were in the film, for instance, the time between amputation, healing, and Jim's trial on the cliff, how long did it take to complete this film from idea to post-production?
Remarkable time,
Well, I mean, because it's, I'm just curious on that aspect, and then I'll follow up with some other questions.
I would say, so we we actually started filming on the story in about February or March of 2017. So Jim had already had his the surgery in the summer of 2016. And in fact, the Boston Globe wrote an article about this, and that's kind of what first put it on Gideon's radar and my radar. So we came in a bit after that, right before Jim entered into the lab for these studies. So a lot of the footage that we use from the day of Jim's surgery comes from Brigham and Women's Hospital's video team. So we were able to gain access to use that. So the filming, basically, we filmed for a couple of years and editing all along the way. So it was sort of the story that, we needed, from a narrative point of view, we needed time to elapse for everything to sort of unfold before we could sort of conclude and sort of button up the edit. So I'd say, yeah, good 2 years of both filming and editing simultaneously.
So Gideon, does Stat do a lot of documentary production?
No, this was our second film. The first one was about a 30-minute documentary that was actually narrated by Alex Hogan, who is one of our who works at Stat, and it was a film about the opioid crisis. And Alex grew up in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston, working class, and he kept coming to the office in suit and tie because he was going to funerals. And that led him, we decided, Alex, you got to tell this story. So he ended up doing a film with Matt that told the story of this group of friends he grew up with, many of whom had died of opioid overdoses. But that gave us, I guess, sort of the confidence to try to take on a project like this. And Matt can talk more about that. But, I think we would like to do more, but it's an incredible amount of work and resources. So it's hard for a small news operation to do that.
Yeah, well, that's what I was wondering about, because Stat is a news operation that doesn't normally make films. And I wonder if there were any differences in your regular work being a producer for this documentary than any of your other projects.
Yeah, I mean, it was my first involvement really in this form of storytelling. And I found that, many of the same notions of how you tell a story hold true in this medium. You have to have a great central character. And fortunately, we found Hugh. And you have to keep people interested all along. But it's so much more involved than to be thinking about sound and how it looks and telling the story on multiple levels. So it was a real education for me. And fortunately, I had a really good teacher in Matt.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
I'm just going to add, it was just, it takes 2 years to sort of produce something like this, but it's not like the sole focus per se, although it was, for much of those 2 years, it was my sole focus, but you're still doing other things. So.
Yeah, I will say our executive editor was getting impatient as it went along.
Right.
Because we had told them this could be a short film. It will take only a few months.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, as story develops, as we all know, and as Hugh knows as an engineer himself, you start with one end of a thing you're trying to get, and as mutant as being, then you see a larger picture and a larger story. Gentlemen, thank you so much for adding some production knowledge to those who are not a crazy New Yorker like me, where everybody I know is a PA. To give them some context on what it takes to make a film like this, right? But Hugh, now I'm going to pay solely attention to you, mostly. I'm trying. Watch out, okay? So there's one thing that we both agree on, right? In the film, you say, I don't like the word disabled. The word disabled implies that there is a weakness. I also hate that word too. The English language sucks anyway. So maybe you can kind of emphasize for some of those people who are able-bodied allies exactly just kind of expound on that term?
Yeah, well, I can begin by describing my own personal experience. So I was in a mountain climbing accident, suffered severe frostbite. Both my legs were amputated, as the film describes. After the accident, after my amputations, the way I was treated by folks, by society, was just remarkable. I was suddenly this, before the accident, I was this elite athlete, powerful, sexy. And then my body changed and suddenly I was weak and crippled and my life was over. And I was like, what? No, I'm the same person. My feet don't define me. So that was a remarkable experience. And then something else happened. I started tinkering and designing my own legs. And from that, I was lucky and fortunate that I could be successful in the technological aspects, and I could climb better with technology than I could with biological legs. And then suddenly I was treated differently once again. But this time I was treated as a threat, and I was accused of not being a great athlete, but accused of cheating in my sport. Overnight, it was like flipping a switch. So it just that whole narrative really taught me that we have so many body differences and mind differences in the world, and they're not embraced. Society has this remarkably narrow view of what beauty is and what a good body is and what a bad body is, which is utterly silly and a completely cultural construct. And what's exciting to me about Bionics is we can completely change that narrative. We can give people the freedom who have a body difference that limits their ability to see or hear or dance or whatever it may be. And if they want those freedoms, to be able to offer that with Bionics. So I view my work as really an area of human rights, and ultimately via the vehicle of technology, giving people the right to their own abilities, if you will.
I think that answers Pamela Dunn's question, which is in the chat, which asked about, what drives you the most? And you answered that very well without me even having to ask it. So thanks, Hugh. You also said that you dream of being a cyborg. Now, of course, as to many layman's non-technical folk, that means a lot of things. They've seen a lot of sci-fi movies. Thank you, Marvel. But also as an amputee, especially a lot of the active amputees, we tend to go with the more, I guess you could say, simpler technology prosthetic, less fluff, right? So do you believe that your dream of being a cyborg is because, you're not a congenital amputee? So for instance, both you and I, Hugh, are not congenital amputees. And for those who don't know what that means, it means we are not born with our limb differences. So we have a cognizant renaissance of what it feels to have our full limbs. We know where our toes used to be. You mentioned that in the movie about, where the nerve endings, cut. And sometimes I feel like I still feel the top of my foot or my big toe, even 10 years, it's been 11 years later. I'm sorry, I lost my thought because I just rambled. Sorry about that. Do you think the cyborg technology that you are working on will cross-translate to those maybe in the paraplegic community too, who also have that limb loss sensation, that you're also working on those I guess you could say, revitalization of nerve endings for the Ewing surgery?
Yeah, so first of all, I define cyborg as a bidirectional linkage between the human nervous system and a built device that's typically worn on the body. And bidirectional so means that you can think and affect synthetic computation on the device, and the sensors on the device can actually, and the computers can actually input information into the human nervous system. For the case of amputation, that means a person like myself can actually, and yourself can actually feel there's the synthetic part of your body. And what we're discovering is when you have that bidirectionality, when you have natural sensations, that the designed part of your body, the prosthesis, becomes part of you, and it ceases to become a simple tool. So we're at a really critical point in human history where in the past, we've, as humans, we've developed many, many tools and we've integrated with those tools, but they're still tools. They're separate from our bodies. A hammer is very useful, but it's still not part of us.
Mm.
So what we're seeing now when we neurologically couple the human nervous system to a design construct, that construct, even though it's synthetic, becomes part of self, becomes human, if you will. So I often say, if you can feel it, it becomes you, which is fascinating because it means we can extend human structure, morphology, dynamics in the future any way we desire as designers of our own bodies, our own being.
That is a beautifully well put sentiment and a look at possibility. Thank you, Hugh. We mentioned briefly before in one of my rambling questions, that in the film, the same doctor that helped you develop this Ewing amputation, which is so cool to have something named after you. Kudos to Jim. Also is working on, we talked about the reanimation of the muscles, which have atrophied for yourself, being that you're so long out of amputation. And so much time has passed between the start of this film and Jim's amputation in 2017. Are we close? Like, where are we now on this timeline of development?
We've done approximately 30 people now. Namely, we've 30 people we've amputated a limb and created these dynamic muscle constructs and proprioceptive models. So it's expanding rapidly. We have funding from many agencies in the US government to drive this research at all levels. So below the knee, such as Jim, above the knee, below the elbow, above the elbow. So all forms of amputation. It's our vision that we'll receive this type of care in the future. And we're also developing ways of, you can create these dynamic muscle pairs, but we also talk to them via computers. So we're also developing in parallel synthetic implants that will go into those muscles to be able to read out their length and speed and force so that a person can directly control wearable robots.
I have a question, which is coming from my friend Frey in Belgium. He is Frey Lay, because he told me I have to say his name. He's a huge fan. Frey Lay, a competitive paraclimber and a mechanical engineer out of Belgium, is a big fan and inspired by your work. He asked, do you believe artificial muscles would help? In his opinion, is it good? It's in Frey's opinion, sorry, that it's a key to good prosthetics, but at the moment don't exist.
Right. So in terms of the function of the external prosthesis, the motor is very critical. Electric motors, remarkably, there's still invention to be had in electric motors. They're not as good as they will become in the near future, in my estimation. And then there's the realm, as was stated, of artificial muscles, which is typically means, a motor spins in a rotary fashion. Artificial muscles are like muscles and they contract and stretch. So there's a whole host of artificial muscles. They're not as good yet as electric motors, but I'm sure that will change in the coming decades. And then we'll have really biomimetic artificial structures, which will be exciting.
Thank you for answering these science anatomy questions. And I hope my friends in the paraclimbing community, engineering community, are happy with my questions. I'm going to move on to my favorite questions, which are obviously about climbing. So in the making of this film, fun question here. Matt, were you a climber? Because I see you did a lot of first POV documentary shots, which I absolutely love. Which, by the way, especially during this pandemic, many people with disabilities could not go out, especially New York City was complete lockdown. Boston was complete lockdown. And one of the things we did was we did these walks on live, right? And giving that POV. And I thought one of the things that I don't know if you realize how accessible you actually made that for a lot of people to go on the same trails and the same mountains. Did you literally go to the mountain where in which Hugh and his friend had lost some of their limbs?
We did. That was, I am not a climber myself. I actually have a terrible fear of heights. I'm like I grew up in New York, and until later in life, I was not much of an outdoors person, but I am now. And I actually really, this working on this film has got me very much interested in climbing. But we had somebody with us who is an experienced climber in the Cayman Islands, who is also a shooter. So any of those shots down, on the cliff from the rope perspective were done by that shooter. We spent time, in the Cayman Islands where Jim fell, sort of recreating what happened there. And of course, seeing Jim getting to climb again at the end of the film using the robotic foot was pretty exciting. And we also spent time up in New Hampshire, and especially in the winter of, I think, 2018. My colleague and I spent a few days out there up on Mount Washington capturing shots so we could help recreate what happened in the winter of 1982 with Hugh.
That's amazing, Matt, and also a very lucky way to spend a budget. I mean,
yeah, I'm not complaining about having to go to the Cayman Islands for a week.
What a shame! How dare you?
That was pure drudgery. It's terrible.
All that sunshine, who needs it?
They left me back in Boston.
Oh yeah, Gideon, did you get to be live?
I didn't get to go to the Caymans.
The hard job of being the producer.
Producers don't get to go on the field.
Yeah.
You couldn't make up an excuse and write you in the budget. And I just want to make sure, this camera is working. No, nothing. Oh, what a shame. One more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience because I'm supposed to do a clean 30 minutes, and I like to be punctual. So what's next on the list of storytelling? Now, Hugh, you've had these guys in your face for years. Luckily, they're already friends with you. Jim as well. Would you do another film? Because I think your POV is so important because especially when you started in prosthetics, there weren't other amputees who were working in prosthetics. So it was a pioneering in a lot of way, especially since when you look at people with disabilities in general, you have like a small percentage of us that hold full-time jobs, let alone things that directly, help what we do in everyday life. And I wonder if you're interested in, exploring the lives of some of these people who have received the surgeries that are testing out your prosthetic and continue this storytelling, either with STAT or elsewhere.
Yeah, it'd certainly be fun. And, I mentioned there's approximately 30 people now that have received the AMI amputation. Boy, it's a remarkable cohort. Marathons and mountain climbing and diving, and it's just it's so amazing. Often in so many of these individuals, they get the amputation and then they lose all this weight because they're like doing extreme sports. So it's a lot of them are involved in a trial that we have underway in the lab to fit prostheses to the residuum. And it's been a challenge because as they're doing all these extreme activities, they lose weight and we have to refit them. And so it's been remarkable to see how well everyone has performed. And yeah, telling their stories would be fantastic for sure.
Yeah, I definitely would love to see it. I think
I can jump in. So we actually are working on telling the story of the first man who received the upper arm amputation. And Matt and I are working together on that. We're doing a short film on him, which hopefully we'll be putting up on STAT's website in the next month or so.
We just had him in and he controlled a virtual hand.
Yeah, I'm going to see him. He's going to be in Boston next week. Are you going to meet with him when he's in town?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I mean, no big deal, but I'm going to also be in Boston from May 14th to 16th. I mean, I have some outdoor climbing to do in Hammond Pond, but I'm just going to be like, around Just saying.
No?
We'll get together.
I'll be around. It's been a while since I visited the MIT lab, years actually. I think we toured your lab. You weren't there, but we toured your lab as part of our paraclimbing nationals competition weekend. We had hosted paraclimbing nationals, and it was really great for the young folks to see, you know, what was being worked on, and just let you know, even those who don't know anything about engineering are inspired by the work and hopeful for what they'll be able to do in the future because of your work. And I want to thank Gideon and Matthew for this brilliant storytelling. Honestly, I believe the editing, the visual editing, I was just like, oh yeah, this is top-notch stuff. You know, who cares how long it took, Gideon? Okay, you tell them, did you see this? You know, it was amazing. I loved it because I've seen a lot of documentaries. Some I, you know, stopped watching or listening to because it kind of gives it a drone, but you guys kept it interesting. And shout out to, of course, your contributing filmmakers in the Cayman Islands. I'm also know Jimmy Chin, so I know how hard that is to do. So kudos to them, even though they're not here. So it's time to open it up to the audience questions. I was told I don't have to do it, that someone else will, but I'm glad to do it as well.
I'm happy to jump in. We've started already contacting people behind the scenes.
Gotcha.
Thank you. Thank you, Karima, for an amazing job. And first one on is Lynn Bartner-Weasel. Lynn.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me well? Yes, good, thanks. What a fantastic film. Thank you all for making this. It was so interesting. And I have a bunch of friends that can't wait to go to your lab, Hugh, and get a tour and learn and be inspired to become engineers also. So my simple question is, does Jim yet have his own artificial foot that he can take home and keep yet?
I think you're referring to a bionic foot. The answer is no. The prosthesis that was used in the film in the lab has not yet gone through the FDA process. We're now beginning to work on that and march down that pathway. So these to commercialize these bionic systems is a heavy lift, as I'm sure you understand. It takes a huge amount of time and investment, but we're committed and we're marching down that pathway. You're muted.
We're going to jump to the next question. Amy, you're on the line.
I'm just unmuting myself. I actually think that you have just answered my question, because it was, how long would it be before average people would have access to these limbs? And also I was wondering if they could be effective for people, say someone elderly for whom the surgery might be risky. And please ignore my dogs who are barking.
The joys of Zoom and COVID. Yeah, so one thing to note is that the surgery itself, we think largely falls under standard insurance coverage. So most of the patients that receive the AMI amputation, the procedure was covered by insurance, which is great news. So we don't have a reimbursement problem with the surgery itself. As I mentioned earlier, we need a minimally invasive way to get signals from the dynamic muscle pairs. So what we're developing in lab is we implant muscles with small magnetic spheres. And then with electronics outside the body, we can compute the spatial position of a sphere inside a muscle tissue. So as the muscle tissue moves, we can track those movements with incredible accuracy and precision. That's an interesting technology because all we put in the body are passive beads. So the surgery is very, very minimal. So we think that type of interface we can get through the FDA, and we can get through the cost issues as well and get it to market quickly.
Here, the FDA has been improving things at record speed recently.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have a question here from JT that I was asked to read. The deaf community is at times critical of implants on a cultural level. What is the response to the impact of robotic prosthetics on disability identity?
Yeah, I'm not an expert. My view is that regarding technology and hearing impairment, there's a language and a cultural involved. It involves sign language and a language and a whole culture coupled to that language. So a technology that disrupts that and therefore disrupts the whole culture and the language can be problematic. You know, with an artificial limb, there's no language behind the artificial limb, and therefore not as a robust culture, if you will. So that's my view, that it's a really different arena in terms of using technology to fundamentally change human capability.
Garima, did you want to add to that?
Sure, I could say, because, you know, the people I surround myself are very active amputees. You know, they're rock climbers, they're skiers, and there's a lot of factors that go into it. For instance, as a below knee amputee, there's a lot of sports I can't do without a prosthetic, while an above the knee amputee may choose to climb without a prosthetic and find it more comfortable to do so because an above knee prosthetic is 15 pounds, you know, that's like a lot of dead weight if you're going up 5'11s. But as technology advances, you know, and more options are available, it's kind of like when someone says, well, which pair of running shoes would you rather wear and why do you wear them? You know, like, this is lighter, this does this, I do this, I walk this way, you know, and what Hugh is doing is producing more options on how we view our prosthetics or our pair of shoes per se.
Yeah, I want to echo those comments. I said earlier, to me, it's about giving people freedoms that they currently don't have. So we live in a world now where if you have a spinal cord injury and that causes paralysis in your legs and you want to dance, you know, bipedally as you did before the traumatic injury, you can't. So I want to live in a world where we have technology where if a person wants that for themselves, they can have it. That's what I mean about freedom and control over one's own body and capabilities. If one doesn't want the intervention, the technology, they should be free not to use the technology. Absolutely.
Very, very well put. We have a question from James. James, I'm asking you to unmute. You're set.
Hi, I am an older generation of disabled person who was told about 30 years ago, if we have newer stuff, more that you were a child, and we could fit you with newer chairs or bionics that would fit your disability. I have cerebral palsy. I'm a triparetic. Is there someone working today saying we want to design a wheelchair for a person in their 50s or 60s where they could control it with their mind or with their arms for their legs? And if so, what point in the future do we have a chair that acts as the prosthetics do in your lab? This is to you, Hare.
Thank you for the question. I'll just a broad comment that there's so many developments that should be happening that are not. There's not enough people in the field. There's not enough funding. There's so much work to do. I still view the field as in the dark ages compared to where it needs to be. So there is work with central brain implants that allows a person to think and to control any device. It could be a wheelchair or a computer screen or whatever. So that there's nothing commercially available now, but I'm confident such technologies will be made safe and readily available, probably in a decade or 2 decades.
Thank you. I'm seeing a question here from Bruce Rosen. Bruce, I can bring you on air to ask. You're on.
This is a simple one. 50, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
53% of our federal budget is now going to the military. That's what's admitted. Could that be a problem? Obviously, in terms of resources. And you do mention in the film that you have DOD there to deal with people who have had serious injuries in our very many wars. But should that be the way that we, do this research? That, what else?
So if you look at prosthetic innovation through history, certainly in this country, but I think it extends to other regions of the world, you see spikes in innovation during and after every major war. So World War II, for example, there was incredible innovations happening in prostheses. And of course, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan recently have triggered a great deal of funding and innovation. So the DoD already invests a great deal of those funds for medical research. Now it's medicine that's focused on injuries and diseases that are common to persons, soldiers and whatnot. But they do invest a great deal of money in medicine. So that's why some of the funding that went into this novel neural interface came from the DoD as part of that portfolio.
We're going to take one last question from Doug. Doug, you're on.
Great. Thanks so much, Isaac. And thanks so much to all involved with the film. I have a question specifically for Hugh. Well, maybe before that, I also mention I also work for Johnson & Johnson. So if there's anything, I'm not sure if you have any discussions with them or need any linkages there, but be happy to facilitate anything to help move this forward. But specifically, I have a progressive form of muscular dystrophy, and I'd just be interested in where you see promising technology for other disabilities, for lack of a better word. I got to be one of the first people to try out the ReWalk exoskeleton a couple years ago, and was less than impressed and thought, well, this is just the first generation, but hasn't really seemed to move forward. So as someone that's really more tuned with the work in this area, I'd just be curious what you see coming and who's working on it.
Yeah, we do a great deal of research in exoskeletons, and I have now a spin-out company called Defy that's really pushing the boundaries of what exoskeletons are able to do in terms of physical augmentation. So there's that domain. There's also the technological goal of being able to control living muscle tissue in a high fidelity manner. So imagine, an exoskeleton has synthetic motors, and the idea is a computer controls those motors and then pushes on the limbs so that the biological limb plus the synthetic limb move in natural ways. Imagine we lived in a world where we could take over the control of biological muscles and not have to use those synthetic motors in the exoskeleton. So we're working on that problem. That would be fantastic because then you wouldn't have to wear this bulky device.
Right.
You could use your own motors, your own muscles to create the movement. So that's a problem that we're very much focused on at MIT.
Oh, great to hear. Well, if you need any volunteers to test something, a lot of people would be happy to do it.
Deal. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Hugh. Gideon and Matthew, what are you guys working on now?
Well, I think Gideon mentioned earlier, just sort of doing a little bit of a follow-up story on the first person to have the Ewing amputation applied to the arm. So that's a story that we'll be publishing, as Gideon said earlier, in about a month. But other than that, actually with Augmented, we we have exciting distribution news coming up. We can't really say it here, but it does require making some revisions to the film. But that announcement will be coming, I think, in a few weeks. Is that so, Gideon?
Fingers crossed. Yes, we're in negotiations with somebody interested in buying the film. A major somebody you've all heard of. So.
Looking forward to it and looking forward to helping spread the word about it, so really everyone could access this wonderful film and learn more. I want to thank you all. A big thanks to Karima Batts for moderating this conversation. Hugh, Gideon, and Matthew, thank you so much for being a part of this. I want to give a big thank you also to our partners, United Spinal, who I think also can relate to some of this conversation, and to all of our partners that help make this possible. Please check them all out on our partner page. We have next up is, of course, our workshop program, which with Lights Camera Access at 3 p.m. At 5 p.m., The World is Bright conversation, and 7 p.m. in a different key. Please join us for that. Please help spread the word. Let people know about these wonderful films. They have just over 24 hours to watch them, so they should all be seeing it while they can. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.